I was standing in the grocery store with a chocolate cake in one hand and an apple pie in the other when I called Mom. "Which one should I bring for Christmas?" She went quiet, then she said, "Oh, we did Christmas yesterday." I laughed because I thought she was joking. Dad took the phone and said everything was easier without you there. An hour later, I gave the untouched cake to a little girl living in a family shelter. 3 hours after that, Mom called me screaming about the house. She thought I was giving her stay with me, because what happened after that Christmas morning changed what I thought family meant forever. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what came next. That morning had begun with none of the warning signs people like to invent afterward. There had been no ominous message waiting on my phone. No argument the night before. No instinct telling me to brace myself. I woke before 7 in my apartment outside Columbus with the same small list running through my head that always appeared on holidays. Wrap the last 2 gifts, pick up dessert, remember the coffee Mom liked. Get to my parents' house early enough to help before everyone else arrived. Outside the sky was the flat winter gray Ohio seemed to specialize in, and a brittle crust of frost silvered the parked cars below my window. I made coffee, tied my hair back, and checked the gifts stacked beside my dining table. One of them was only a symbolic envelope. The real gift could not fit beneath any Christmas tree. 2 months earlier I had bought a small 1-story bungalow for my parents. It sat on a quiet street, about 20 minutes from where they lived, close enough to their doctor, a grocery store and a park with level walking paths Mom liked. It was not a mansion. At around $285,000, it represented something much more personal to me than extravagance. I had spent more than a decade living below what I earned, saving bonuses, leaving profit sharing untouched, and telling myself that someday the money would become something solid. When my company had a particularly strong year someday finally looked possible, I bought the bungalow outright and planned to transfer it to Mom and Dad after Christmas. The title was still entirely in my name. My attorney had prepared the next steps, but nothing had closed. No deed had been delivered, and my parents had no ownership interest in the property. None of that mattered emotionally, though. I had already taken them through the house twice. Mom had stood in the living room with a tape measure, talking about curtains and whether the dining table would look better near the bay window. Dad had claimed the corner of the second bedroom for a reading chair before laughing that he was finally getting too old to pretend he did not need one. Watching them plan had been half the gift. I had thought the other half would be seeing their faces when we made it official. I was used to being the person who made family events run smoothly. Nobody had ever formally assigned me the job. It had accumulated one invisible task at a time. Until it became part of who everyone assumed I was. I was the one who remembered Aunt Marissa hated pecans and bought her a separate dessert. I kept track of what time Leah got off work, which restaurant took reservations, whether Mom had enough serving dishes, and which cousin had become vegetarian since the previous holiday. I arrived early and left late. If 2 people stopped speaking, I seated them farther apart. If Dad forgot someone's gift, I usually had something extra in my trunk. None of those things felt like sacrifices. While I was doing them, they felt like proof that I belonged. The problem was that during the previous couple of years, I had begun to notice how often keeping the peace meant I was expected to swallow whatever made everyone else uncomfortable. 2 weeks before Christmas, we had been eating dinner at my parents' house when Dad made one of his jokes at Leah's expense. It was the sort of remark everyone had learned to laugh at quickly enough that he never had to examine it. Leah stared down at her plate and moved a piece of broccoli back and forth with her fork. I did not make a scene. I simply told Dad the joke was not funny and that Leah clearly did not like it. The room had gone still for perhaps 3 seconds. Dad rolled his eyes and said I had become too serious about everything. Later, Mom told me he thought I had changed the mood. That phrase stayed with me for about a day, then disappeared beneath work deadlines, shopping lists and Christmas preparations. I never imagined it had become evidence against me. By late morning on Christmas Day, I was walking through the bakery section of the grocery store with my phone wedged against my shoulder and 2 desserts in my hands. Chocolate cake was Dad's favorite. Apple pie was Mom's. Normally I would have bought both, but there were already supposed to be too many sweets. At dinner I called Mom, expecting her to choose. The silence after my question was long enough for me to look at the phone screen and make sure the call had not dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had the careful softness she used when she wanted unpleasant information to sound harmless. "Oh, we did Christmas yesterday." For a moment, my brain treated the sentence like nonsense. I actually smiled. I thought maybe she meant they had opened 1 or 2 gifts early because Leah had stopped by, or that Dad had talked everyone into eating part of the ham on Christmas Eve. I asked what she meant. Mom explained that everyone had already been together the previous evening, so they had decided to do dinner and presents then. She said it as if convenience had simply carried them along, as if Christmas had happened spontaneously. While I was somewhere else and nobody had noticed until the dishes were washed, the cake box began to cut into the side of my thumb. I asked the only question that mattered. "You planned it without me." I heard movement on the other end. Then Dad's voice replaced hers. He did not bother softening anything. "Everything was easier without you there." The fluorescent lights above me suddenly seemed too bright. Somewhere behind me, a child was begging his mother for frosted cookies. A cart squeaked past with wrapping paper sticking out of it. The world kept producing ordinary Christmas sounds while my father explained in a few blunt sentences that lately I questioned everything, corrected people and made gatherings tense. They had wanted one peaceful Christmas. He spoke as though the decision had been practical, even considerate. I did not defend myself. I did not list the holidays I had organized or the things I had done for them. I did not mention the house. That surprised me later, because normally I would have started trying to solve the misunderstanding before the other person had finished creating it. Instead, I stood with a chocolate cake in my hand and listened until there was nothing left to misunderstand. When the call ended, I remained in the bakery aisle long enough for another shopper to reach around me for a package of dinner rolls. I put the apple pie back carefully. My hands were steady, which somehow, everything feels stranger. Then I placed the chocolate cake in my cart and continued through the store because my body had apparently decided that completing the shopping trip was easier than deciding what came next. At the register, the cashier wished me Merry Christmas. I thanked her automatically. In the parking lot, I loaded the few bags into my car, placed the cake on the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel without turning the engine on. My parents' gifts were in the trunk. Mom's favorite, coffee, was in one of the bags. The symbolic envelope for the bungalow transfer was still tucked inside my purse. For years I had known what to do on Christmas morning because there had always been somewhere I was expected to arrive. Now there was only a cake nobody was waiting for. I started driving without choosing a destination. The streets were quieter than usual, storefronts dark, traffic thin. About 15 minutes later I passed a community center. Company had supported during a winter supply drive. A banner outside mentioned a Christmas meal for families in temporary housing. I knew there was a family shelter connected to the program, though I had never been inside. I almost kept driving. Then I looked at the untouched cake beside me. I turned around. My plan was simple. Leave the dessert at the front desk, wish someone Merry Christmas and go home. I carried the box through the entrance into a warm room that smelled faintly of coffee, roasted meat, and industrial cleaner paper snowflakes made by children had been taped unevenly across one wall. A volunteer checked that the cake was unopened before accepting it. That was when I noticed the little girl. She stood a few feet away beside a woman carrying a bag of donated clothes. The girl looked about 9 o'clock, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and sleeves slightly too long for her arms. She was not staring at me. She was staring at the cake. Her face changed in a way that no one in my family's house would ever have noticed. Not greed, not even excitement at first. Just surprise, as though an ordinary chocolate cake had arrived from somewhere improbable. For the first time that day, someone was looking at something I had brought, as if it mattered. I had no idea yet that her name was Lila, or that the woman beside her was her mother, Monica. I did not know why they were there, how long they had been staying in temporary housing, or what would happen to the bungalow I had spent years saving for. All I knew was that I had carried love toward one table that had decided it was easier without me, and somehow ended up standing in front of another place where even a simple cake seemed to mean something. Lila lifted her eyes from the box and looked at me. That was where everything began to change. The little girl's eyes moved from me back to the cake, as if she was trying to decide whether she had misunderstood what was happening. The volunteer had already carried it toward the long folding tables at the far end of the room, where disposable plates, mismatched serving spoons, and trays covered in foil had been arranged for the Christmas meal before the box disappeared. The girl glanced toward the woman beside her, then back at me. Is the whole cake really for? There was nothing dramatic in the way she asked it. That was what made it hurt. She sounded like a child checking the rules before she allowed herself to be excited. I told her it was. Her face opened into a smile that lasted only a second before she looked toward her mother again, almost as if happiness itself required permission. The woman introduced herself as Monica Alvarez and gently reminded the girl, Lila, to let the volunteers finish setting up. Monica thanked me for the cake, but she did it without the exaggerated gratitude people sometimes used when they thought a donor expected to be praised. She looked tired rather than defeated, dressed neatly in a blouse under an inexpensive winter coat, with one hand still gripping the handles of the donated clothing bag. I had intended to leave immediately. Instead, I stayed near the entrance while a staff member found a place for my other grocery bags among the donations. Monica and I began talking, because we happened to be standing beside the same table, not because I asked her to explain why she was there. The pieces came gradually. She had worked in payroll for years until the company she worked for closed that fall. Losing the job had been manageable at first. She had some savings and unemployment benefits, and she expected to be working again within weeks. Then the owner of the apartment building sold the property. Monica needed a new deposit, first month's rent moving, and proof of current income at almost exactly the moment she had lost hers. The timing did what the job loss alone had not. By December, she and Lila were staying in temporary family housing while Monica applied for jobs and tried to keep her daughter in the same elementary school. She did not tell me any of that. Like a confession, she spoke the way I might have explained a broken furnace or a delayed project at work. This happened, then this happened, and now I was solving the next problem. That difference mattered. My family had spent years accepting my help as if it naturally belonged to them. Monica seemed uncomfortable even discussing assistance she actually needed. She told me the shelter staff had helped her with applications and transportation, and she had 2 interviews scheduled after the holiday. What she needed was not someone to support her indefinitely. She needed enough stability to work long enough to rebuild a deposit and rental history without having to move Lila again. Lila had wandered closer while we spoke. She was carefully peeling one of the paper snowflakes loose. From the wall where the tape had failed, Monica reminded her to leave it for the staff. Lila pressed it back into place with both palms and said, almost absently, "Mom says we just need one good break." The sentence was so ordinary that it stayed with me. One good break. I had spent the morning holding a gift worth hundreds of thousands of dollars for people who had already decided they could celebrate Christmas without me. Across from me was a woman who was not asking me for anything beyond the dignity of being allowed to explain her situation without pity. I knew enough about community programs through work to understand that housing assistance did not need to mean handing someone keys and hoping for the best. There were organizations built specifically around transitional housing, employment support, and short-term stability. My company had donated to similar programs before, though I had never paid much attention to how they worked. I looked at Monica, then at Lila. "Do you want to change your life?" Even as I said it, I knew how strange the question could sound without context. I clarified immediately that I was not offering them a house or promising something I could not guarantee. I told Monica I knew people who worked with established housing programs and that if she wanted, I could find out what options existed beyond the shelter system she was already using. Monica did not leave at the offer. She asked sensible questions about whether the programs were legitimate and whether accepting information would affect the support she was already receiving. I did not know the answers, so I said I would find out rather than pretending I did. That restraint made me trust her more. When I finally walked back to my car, the passenger seat was empty. The chocolate cake was inside. Already becoming someone else's Christmas dessert, I sat behind the wheel and stared through the windshield at the pale winter sky. The bungalow came into my mind with startling clarity. Mom measuring the windows. Dad choosing his reading corner. The empty bedroom, they had joked, would become the grandchildren's room someday. Though neither Leah nor I had children, I had bought that house because I wanted to give them something permanent. I had imagined Dad carrying Mom across the threshold as a joke. Imagine their first spring in the backyard. Imagine future Christmases around. The dining table Mom had already chosen. None of those memories changed because of one phone call, but the meaning of the gift had. The people who had decided my presence made Christmas harder were still expecting me to hand them the largest thing I had ever given anyone. I did not think, I'll punish them. The thought that kept returning was quieter. Why was I still completing a gift that already felt like something they believed they owned? Because it was Christmas Day, I knew the law office handling the transfer would be closed. There was no fantasy in which an attorney dropped dinner with her family to process a real estate decision for me. I pulled up the email chain instead and sent a short message stating that I was withdrawing my consent to proceed with the gift transfer, and that no further closing or deed delivery steps were to be taken. When the office reopened, then I left the same instruction in a voicemail so there could be no confusion about the time I had made the decision. The legal confirmation could wait. My parents could not. Called Mom myself. I kept the conversation short. I told her I had decided not to move forward with transferring the bungalow to her and Dad, and that they should not make any further plans around owning it. I also told her I had just come from a family shelter, and was considering whether the bungalow might eventually be used through an established transitional housing program. I had not promised it to anyone, and I did not yet know what form that decision would take. Mom was too stunned to argue at first. I ended the call before the familiar cycle could begin. Explanation, guilt, compromise. Then me fixing everything so nobody stayed uncomfortable for long. For the next couple of hours, I tried to do nothing. I drove home, put away groceries I no longer needed for a dinner I was not attending, and placed my parents' wrapped presents in the hall closet because looking at them made my stomach tighten. I made coffee and forgot to drink it. My phone lit up several times, but I did not answer. I could imagine the calls moving through the family without hearing them. Mom telling Dad, Dad calling Leah, someone deciding I was emotional, someone saying I would calm down. They had known me long enough to predict the ending they wanted. Almost exactly 3 hours after Lila had asked whether the whole cake was really for them, Mom's name filled my screen again. This time I answered. She was already angry enough that I had to move the phone slightly away from my ear. Somewhere between our calls, she had taken my mention of transitional housing and turned it into a certainty that I intended to hand the bungalow to strangers. She demanded to know how I could pull the house away after she and Dad had already planned their retirement around it. Then she said the sentence that changed the entire argument. You can't give our house to strangers. I looked across at the symbolic transfer envelope, still lying where I had dropped my purse. A house. The silence was immediate. Mom tried to correct herself. She said she meant the house I had promised them, the one they had already begun planning around. But the correction could not erase the first version. It was never your house, Mom. I did not raise my voice. That seemed to make her angrier. She returned to Christmas, insisting that I was turning one dinner into a punishment for the entire family. As she tried to explain why everyone had wanted a quieter evening, she let something else slip. They had decided the previous weekend, not yesterday afternoon, not because everyone unexpectedly happened to be together the weekend before Christmas. We thought you'd get over it, she said. That sentence landed differently from Dad's cruelty in the grocery store. Dad had told me I was unwanted. Mom had just told me they had known I would be hurt and had built my eventual forgiveness into the plan. I ended the call before she could move us into another argument about the house. The attorney would not confirm the stop transfer until the office reopened. The bungalow would remain mine, whether my parents accepted that fact or not. None of that was what kept me awake that night. Mom had known for days. Dad had known Leah had been there. Other relatives had apparently been there too. Christmas had not happened without me because everyone forgot to call. Someone had made a plan and everyone else had stepped into it. What I did not know yet was how many of them had known I was being left out, or what they had been told to make my empty chair seem normal. Monday morning arrived with the kind of ordinary efficiency I had once depended on. At 9:17, my attorney emailed to confirm that the transfer had never been completed and that my instructions had stopped any further steps. The bungalow was still entirely mine. There was no emergency meeting, no dramatic stack of papers, no legal battle waiting for me. One paragraph settled what my family had spent Christmas treating as a catastrophe. I read the message twice, filed it, and closed my laptop. The legal part was simple. The part one could not stop turning over was what Mom had admitted before hanging up. They had decided the previous weekend that Christmas would happen without me. My phone had been busy since Christmas afternoon. Dad left one message accusing me of using money to punish people. Mom sent several texts insisting that nobody had meant to exclude me permanently, as though there were degrees of exclusion that should have comforted me. Leah's first message was the most revealing because it was the least cruel. She said she thought I had known about the change and that taking back the house felt like an enormous reaction to a family scheduling decision. I did not answer any of them immediately. I had spent too many years responding before I had enough distance to know whether I was fixing a problem or simply making everyone else comfortable again. Instead, I went to work. The office was quiet between Christmas and New Year's. Half the staff had taken vacation, and the fluorescent lights hummed above rows of mostly empty desks. I buried myself in year-end reports and vendor schedules until numbers began behaving more reliably than people. But every time my phone lit up, I thought about the same. If the family truly believed I had other plans, someone would have mentioned those plans to me. That answer came from Aunt Marissa. I had bought her Christmas gift weeks earlier, a small set of specialty teas she liked, and it was still sitting wrapped in the back of my hall closet with everyone else's presents. She called Monday afternoon. Her voice carried the awkwardness of someone who had realized she had participated in something without understanding what it was. Marissa had believed I was busy, not vaguely busy. Mom had specifically told the family that I had made other plans for Christmas and would not be joining them. Marissa said she had asked about me when the date changed because she knew I usually helped Mom organize everything. Elaine had brushed it aside, saying I was doing my own thing that year and that everyone should take advantage of being available on Christmas Eve. The gathering had not formed by accident. The date had been circulating since the previous weekend. I sat on the edge of my sofa with one hand resting on the unopened tea set Marissa would never know I had already bought for her. The room around me was painfully familiar. My blanket folded over the armchair, a mug drying beside the sink, a stack of work mail I had not opened. Nothing looked different. Yet the story of my Christmas had shifted again. Dad had said everything was easier without me. Mom had admitted they thought I would get over it. Now I knew she had given everyone else a version of my absence that made it sound voluntary. Marissa apologized more than once. I could hear how embarrassed she was, but I did not need her guilt. I needed the sequence. She confirmed that the decision had been made days before Christmas, that the family knew I was not expected, and that Mom had supplied an explanation before anyone had a reason to question it. I thanked her for telling me the truth and ended the call before either of us could turn it into something larger. I spent that evening thinking about the word Dad had used in the grocery store. Tension. For years, our family had treated it like weather that appeared whenever I opened my mouth. But lately I had begun to notice when the word actually surfaced at Mom's birthday the year before. Relatives volunteered to help and then disappeared from the planning. I agreed to make the reservation, but refused to also choose the menu, collect money, order flowers and arrange transportation. Dad called it turning a celebration into a negotiation. A few months later, when a relative hit a cutting remark behind a joke, I asked for an apology instead of changing the subject. Then came the dinner 2 weeks before Christmas when Leah stared at her plate and I refused to laugh for Dad. None of those moments involved shouting or anyone storming out. I had simply stopped making discomfort disappear fast enough for everyone else. That was what had changed. Tension was the word our family used when I stopped absorbing it. Leah came to my apartment Tuesday evening. I knew she was nervous before she sat down because she kept smoothing the sleeves of her coat even after taking off. I made coffee and let her talk without interrupting. She explained that Mom had told her I had plans, just as she had told Marissa. Leah had assumed I was spending the evening with friends or people from work. She admitted she found it odd that I had not helped arrange anything, but once the dinner started, she let herself accept the explanation that required the least effort. She still believed I had gone too far with the bungalow. That was the part she kept. Back to she understood that I was hurt, but in her mind, the house belonged in a different category. Christmas was emotional, the house was practical. Retirement plans, furniture, Dad's expectations, Mom's excitement. She could not yet see that separating those things was exactly what had allowed everyone to treat me the way they had. I did not explain it again. Instead, I asked her one question. Did you notice I wasn't there? Leah stopped, rubbing the seam of her sleeve. The answer was written across her face before she gave me anything aloud. Of course, she had noticed my place at family gatherings was too predictable not to notice. I was usually the person arriving with bags in both hands, checking the oven, moving chairs, asking who still needed a drink. My absence would have changed the rhythm of the room, even if nobody said my name. Leah admitted that she noticed she had simply accepted Mom's explanation and kept eating. That hurt more than anger would have. I looked toward the small pile of wrapped gifts still visible through the open closet door. Leah's was in there too. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me since Marissa called. If all of you really thought I had other plans, why didn't anyone text me Merry Christmas? Leah's eyes dropped. There was no answer that could make it innocent. They had exchanged gifts. They had eaten dinner. They had taken pictures. They had apparently talked about me enough to accept that I was somewhere else. Yet not one person had sent a message that evening asking whether I was having a good Christmas. Not even the kind of automatic holiday text people sent to coworkers they barely knew. Leah's shoulders sank a little. She said she had not thought about it until that moment. I believed her. That was almost the worst part. The absence of a message had not been deliberate cruelty. It had been evidence of something quieter. Everyone had become so comfortable with the idea that I would continue belonging, no matter how little effort they made, that checking on me had stopped feeling necessary. I told Leah I was not asking her to choose sides. I was not even asking her to defend me. I only wanted the truth, especially if the truth made all of us uncomfortable. She sat there for a long time after that. Then something shifted in her expression. Her eyes moved toward the closet where the edge of one wrapped gift was visible, and then back to me. I could almost see a memory rearranging itself behind her face. She said Dad had mentioned the bungalow during Christmas dinner, not in passing. Something more specific. Leah frowned and pressed her fingers against her forehead, trying to recover the exact wording. I stopped her before she guessed I had had enough of stories built from what people thought they remembered. Think about it, I told her. Call me when you're sure. She nodded. After she left, I stood by the window, watching her car disappear beneath the bare trees lining my street. Until then, I had believed the worst thing my family had done was celebrate Christmas without me. For the first time, I wondered what exactly they had celebrated while I was gone. I waited until the next morning before driving to the bungalow. I had not been there since before Christmas. And for several minutes I stayed in the driveway with the engine running, looking at the narrow brick path, the frost edging the lawn, and the bay window Mom had loved. Immediately inside, the rooms were technically empty, but still crowded with their plans. I could see Mom stretching a tape measure across the living room windows and Dad claiming the corner of the second bedroom for his reading chair. I had loved watching them imagine themselves there. Their excitement had been half the gift. What I had not noticed was the way their language changed. On the first visit, Mom called it the house I was giving them. Later it became their retirement place. By the last visit, she was talking about where our Christmas tree would go next year. Possession had replaced gratitude so gradually that I had mistaken it for excitement. In the kitchen, a faint pencil mark still showed where Dad had measured for a coffee station. I rubbed at it with my thumb and understood why Mom had been able to shout our house without hearing anything strange in the words. They had already moved into it in their minds. My phone vibrated against the counter. I let it ring once before answering. He did not waste time with greetings. He wanted to meet. He said the phone had made everything worse and that we needed to talk face to face like adults. I almost laughed at the phrase. For 3 days, everyone had treated my decision like an emotional outburst that would disappear if they could get me into the right room and speak to me long enough. I told him where I was. He arrived about 20 minutes later. The first thing he did after walking through the front door was look around the living room, as though checking whether anything had been moved. His gaze landed briefly on the bare corner where he had planned to put his chair. Then he took off his gloves and slipped them into his coat pocket. That tiny movement told me more than his expression did. He still felt at home here. Dad began by accusing me of using money to control the family. He said gifts were not supposed to come with conditions, and that withdrawing the bungalow because my feelings had been hurt made the original gesture look transactional. I listened without interrupting. A year earlier, I would have rushed to prove I was not controlling. I would have explained my intentions until he found one he could accept. Instead, I watched him pace across a living room he did not own while telling me I had made ownership conditional. When he finally stopped, I told him there had never been a condition attached to the house. I had not asked to be thanked publicly, consulted about their furniture, or given a permanent seat at every gathering. Because I was paying for something, I had simply assumed my parents wanted me at Christmas. Dad's jaw tightened. He said Christmas and the house were separate issues. The simplicity of that answer clarified more than another argument could have. In his mind, my presence could be removed from the table while the gift remained untouched. He saw no contradiction between deciding I made Christmas unpleasant and still expecting the house I had promised to provide. Dad reminded me of everything parents did for children over the course of a lifetime. He did not produce a list, and I did not ask for one. His argument was broader than money. Parents sacrificed. Children grew up successful. Children were supposed to want to make life easier for the people who raised them. Something like this is what a daughter in your position should want to do. The words settled into the empty room. I looked toward the bay window where Mom had measured for curtains. I had wanted to do it. That was what made his sentence so ugly. Somewhere between my desire to give and his expectation of receiving the gift had been converted into a duty. Gratitude had disappeared because, in his mind, I was only fulfilling a role. I asked him whether he understood the difference between wanting to give someone something and being told they were entitled to it. He dismissed the question as another example of what had made family gatherings exhausting lately. According to him, every conversation now became an argument about wording, boundaries, or respect. I no longer let things pass. Corrected people. I made everyone think about what they said before they said it. He meant it as criticism. I thought about Leah staring at her plate 2 weeks before Christmas while he made her the subject of a joke, and about the 3 seconds of silence after I told him to stop. Dad said he had wanted one Christmas where nobody needed to watch every sentence. That was the complaint beneath everything else. Not that I had screamed at anyone or ruined a previous holiday, but that people could no longer assume I would make their discomfort disappear for them. I walked toward the front window. Outside, a delivery truck moved slowly along the street, tires cracking over a thin patch of ice. A house 2 doors down still had an inflatable snowman leaning sideways in the yard behind me. Dad continued explaining that families needed room to relax around one another. I could have argued with the word relax. I could have told him that peace purchased. By selecting one person to exclude was not peace at all. I did not. There was one thing I needed to know more. I turned around. Did you talk about the house at Christmas? Dad's expression changed so slightly that I might have missed it a week earlier. His eyes moved away from mine and landed on the kitchen doorway. Then he started talking about retirement. He said Mom had been making plans for months. They had discussed what to do with their current place, what furniture they would keep, and how much easier one-story living would be as they got older. Pulling the bungalow away had forced them to rethink everything. He never answered my question. I let the silence sit there long enough for him to realize I had noticed. Then I picked up my keys. Dad seemed surprised that the conversation was ending. He had arrived expecting the old version of me, the one who stayed until every disagreement had been turned into something everyone could live with. But I no longer needed him to agree with me. Before I could leave, I told him I was not discussing the house further that day. He stood in the middle of the living room while I opened the front door. For a moment I saw the bungalow through his eyes, the reading corner, the future holidays, the retirement he had already started treating as settled. I almost felt guilty. Then I remembered the grocery store aisle and his voice telling me everything had been easier without me. I locked the door after we stepped outside. That afternoon Leah called. Her voice was different from the night she had sat in my apartment. The uncertainty was gone. What remained sounded more like shame. She had remembered what Dad said during Christmas dinner. The meal had already been underway. Gifts were stacked near the tree. At some point Dad had raised his glass and started talking about the coming year. Leah did not remember every word, and I did not ask her to reconstruct them. She was certain about the part that mattered. Next Christmas we'll all be at our new place. People had lifted their glasses. Someone had congratulated Mom and Dad again. They had toasted the bungalow. I sat on the floor of the empty living room after Leah's call ended, my back against the wall beneath the bay window. I pictured the table without inventing details I had not seen. I did not know who sat where. I did not know what they ate first or which presents were opened after dinner. I only knew what Leah had told me. My family had gathered for a Christmas they deliberately kept from me. My mother had told everyone I had other plans. My father had raised a glass to a future inside a house I was giving them, and everyone had celebrated. The room around me was so quiet I could hear the heating system click on. Until that moment, I had thought they had simply enjoyed Christmas without me. Now I understood something worse. They had been perfectly willing to celebrate what I gave them without needing the person who gave it. I stayed on the living room floor after Leah's call, the winter light sliding across the hardwood where Mom had imagined her dining table. The toast had settled the question I had been arguing with since Christmas. I had not bought the bungalow because my parents lacked shelter. I had bought it because I wanted to give them comfort. I wanted Dad to stop worrying about stairs as he got older. And Mom to have the sunny kitchen she had always talked about. Had been my clearest way of saying I love you. I want the next part of your life to be easier. Now, every time I pictured completing the transfer, I saw Dad lifting his glass at a Christmas he had deliberately kept from me. The house had not become a weapon, and I did not need to turn it into one. The gesture itself had changed. Before leaving, I walked once through the empty rooms. Dad's reading corner was still only an empty patch of carpet. Mom's coffee mugs had never occupied the kitchen. I could grieve the future I once pictured for them without pretending I still wanted to sign that future over. For the first time since Christmas, I left the bungalow without arguing with myself about that decision. Leah called again the following evening. She did not mention the bungalow at first. That alone told me something had changed. She had spent the day thinking about the dinner, the toast, and the question I had asked in my apartment. If everyone genuinely believed I had other plans, why had no one sent me so much as a Christmas message? This time she did not search for an explanation. That made her look better. She admitted that she had noticed my absence almost immediately. She had also noticed Mom checking the oven repeatedly, hunting for serving spoons, and asking whether anyone remembered extra ice things I normally handled. Yet Leah had accepted the answer that allowed the evening to continue. Then she apologized for what she had actually done. She had seen I was missing and had decided it was easier not to question it. I sat at my kitchen table with one hand around a mug that had gone cold. Everyone always thinks I'll be fine, I said. Leah was quiet for several seconds, then admitted she thought that was true. There was no dramatic reconciliation, but for the first time, someone in my family had looked at what happened without immediately asking what it meant for the house. A few days later, Mom called about a family lunch she wanted to arrange in January. The request arrived so naturally that for a moment I nearly slipped back into the old rhythm. Mom was not sure which weekend work. Dad disliked one restaurant, Leah had a complicated schedule, and Aunt Marissa needed enough notice. Normally, I would have opened my calendar before Mom finished explaining the problem. My fingers actually moved toward the laptop before I stopped them. I told her to choose the date and restaurant that worked for her and let me know if she wanted to invite me. The silence on the other end was confusion before it became irritation. Mom eventually said I was being cold. For years, tasks had moved toward me without anyone having to ask directly. I had trained my family almost as thoroughly as they had trained me. This time, I let her disappointment remain hers. The following week, I returned to the family shelter. This time I did not bring dessert. I asked the staff about established transitional housing programs for families who had income potential but needed a stable bridge between shelter and independent housing. I wanted to know which organizations used case managers, how long placements lasted, and what kind of employment and rental planning support they provided. I also made one thing clear. I was not asking anyone to choose Monica because I had met her on Christmas. If I used the bungalow this way, the program, not my emotions, would decide who qualified. Monica was at a job interview that afternoon. Lila sat in the common area with schoolwork spread across a table, pressing hard enough with her pencil to leave grooves in the workshop. She saw me, smiled, and returned to whatever problem she was solving. The ordinariness of the moment stayed with me. She was not a symbol. She was a 9-year-old doing homework while her mother tried to rebuild a life. The staff gave me information on several established organizations. One used single-family homes for transitional placements lasting roughly 9 to 12 months. Families worked with case managers, maintained employment or active job searches, built savings plans, and prepared for permanent housing. The owner could retain title through a long-term use agreement while the nonprofit handled screening and day-to-day responsibilities. I took the materials home, checked the organization's history, and sent my attorney a short list of practical questions. There would be inspections, insurance issues, and written responsibilities to settle. Nothing about it could happen overnight, and that reassured me. Whatever came next needed to make sense. After the anger was gone one night, I pulled out the floor plan for the bungalow. Mom's measurements were still penciled along one edge. Dad had once circled the second bedroom and written chair beside it as a joke. I stared at those marks for a while. Then I turned the page over. For the first time, I pictured the house without my parents inside it. Not Monica specifically, not Lila. I had already decided I would not choose. I imagined a mother unlocking the door after months of temporary rooms, a child putting down a backpack somewhere, knowing it would still be there the next morning. The bungalow had started as proof that I loved my parents. It did not have to be proof that I hated them. Could become something else. Could become a second chance. The decision about the bungalow did not happen in one brave moment. For the next several weeks, I kept waiting for my anger to cool enough that I could tell whether the idea still made sense without it. I read through the programs I had been given, compared how they handled placements, and kept returning to the organization that had operated trans homes for years. It did not promise rescue. It offered time structure, case management, and a stable address. My attorney reviewed the proposed arrangement and confirmed that I would keep title to the bungalow while the nonprofit operated it through a long-term agreement. There would be inspections, insurance changes, and written responsibilities before anyone moved in. Took weeks, not hours, which was important to me. Christmas had forced one immediate decision. My parents would not receive the house, but everything after that deserved more care. When the program asked whether there was a family I wanted considered, I said no. I declined access to applicant files as well. Monica and Lila were the reason I had looked at the house differently, but meeting them once did not qualify me to decide who needed it most. This time, helping did not require controlling the outcome. I could open a door without deciding who walked through it. My family did not understand that distinction. Yet Dad proved it one Thursday afternoon when he called about a warranty problem with an appliance at my parents' house. The manufacturer had rejected his online request because he entered the wrong purchase date. Normally, he would have given me the model number, and I would have handled the rest. Before dinner, I opened my laptop on reflex, then stopped. I gave him the customer service number and told him which information they would ask for. Dad reminded me that I had always dealt with those things. There was nothing I could do that he physically could not. I would simply have done it faster. When I told him he could handle this one, he accused me of still punishing him over Christmas. For years he had called my help generosity. The first time I withdrew it, he called the absence punishment. Closed the laptop. A few days later, Mom hosted the family lunch she had asked me to organize. She chose the date herself. Leah coordinated her own schedule. Aunt Marissa confirmed directly with Mom. Nobody asked me to make the reservation or remind the guests I was invited, and I went. Setting a boundary did not require turning every family event into a test. The lunch was not a disaster. It was simply less smooth. Mom had given 2 people different starting times, so Marissa arrived late. Dad assumed Mom had called ahead about the table, while Mom assumed Dad had done it. And no one remembered to mention Leah's food preference. Mom spent the first part of the meal looking flustered. Once her eyes landed on me with the old expectation that I would step in, I kept talking to Leah instead. Eventually everyone ate. Marissa laughed about the mix-up and Dad stopped checking his watch. They adjusted. They always could have. The bungalow moved through its own quieter process while my family learned to do the same. The inspection found only minor maintenance issues. I approved the work. The non-profit completed its review, and by early spring my attorney and theirs had settled the long-term use agreement. I signed the documents at my kitchen table and sent them back. There was no dramatic handoff. The title remained mine, but the purpose of the house had changed. A few days later, I met program staff at the bungalow while they prepared it for a first placement. They checked smoke detectors, measured for basic furniture, and made notes about storage. A small dining table, a lamp, and a second-hand bookshelf made the rooms look different from the future Mom had once planned there. For a moment, the grief came back hard enough that I stepped onto the porch. I could still see Mom at the bay window and Dad pointing toward his reading corner. I still wished Christmas had happened differently. Changing direction had not erased the future I once imagined. It had only stopped that future from deciding what I did next. Later that week, the program coordinator told me they had begun evaluating families for the first placement. She did not give me names or applications exactly as we had agreed. I did not ask for them at the shelter. I had heard only that Monica was still working with her case manager, and that transitional housing had become a real possibility. I did not know whether she had applied for this bungalow where she ranked what other families needed or what the program would decide. I did not ask. I had done what belonged to me. The rest of the decision belonged to people whose lives I did not control. If Monica and Lila were among them, I would learn when the process was finished. By spring, my life had begun to develop empty spaces. First, they felt wrong. There were Saturday mornings when nobody needed me to compare reservations, evenings when I saw friends I had postponed too many times, and weekends when I did not know what my parents were doing. I signed up for a class simply because I wanted to try something new. Once or twice a month, I volunteered with a housing program. But I chose ordinary tasks instead of becoming the person everyone depended on. The guilt did not disappear. Some nights I still reached for my phone because I missed Mom or thought of Dad when I passed the hardware store he liked. What changed was that I stopped treating every empty hour as evidence that I had failed someone. Free time began to feel less like absence and more like room. Mom's birthday came in early spring. 4 years, Mom's birthday had existed in my calendar like a small project. I chose the restaurant, reminded Leah, ordered flowers, checked that Dad had bought a card, and found the cake Mom preferred. This year, I bought her a thoughtful gift and called in the morning, but I left the evening to the people attending it. Dad chose the restaurant. Leah arranged her own schedule. No one ordered dessert early enough. So they bought a grocery store cake at the last minute. They still ate dinner and celebrated. Several days later, Mom called and said the birthday had felt different. The reservation had been too late for the time she preferred, the flowers were remembered at the last minute, and the cake was chocolate instead of lemon. Then she said, I was withholding affection. I was drying a coffee mug when the words stopped my hands. I had remembered her birthday, called, bought her a gift and told her I loved her. What was missing was the invisible labor around those gestures. Mom had experienced that labor for so long that its absence looked like less love. I told her I had not forgotten her birthday. I did not offer to make next year run more smoothly. A week later, Dad called. Dad did not mention Mom's birthday directly. He said the family had not been the same since Christmas and listed the evidence without realizing it. Plans took longer, people forgot details. Mom became frustrated. Leah no longer automatically agreed to whatever schedule was suggested. I listened until he finished, then told him that if one person had to carry an entire system for it to function smoothly, the responsibility had never really been shared. Dad dismissed that as me turning family into a management problem. This time I did not search for a better explanation. He was allowed to misunderstand me. The bungalow continued moving forward without requiring my attention. Every day the non-profit handled the placement process. I received updates about the property itself, maintenance, readiness, administrative details, but nothing about applicant files. That was exactly what I had asked for. One afternoon, while dropping off donated supplies at the shelter, I saw Monica for the first time in several weeks. She looked different, though it took me a moment to understand why. Tiredness had not disappeared completely, but there was less hesitation in the way she moved. She had found a stable job with hours that worked around Lila's school and had begun rebuilding savings. There were still obstacles, and a permanent apartment was still ahead of her, but she was moving. She talked about the caseworker and shelter staff who were helping her plan the next steps. Then our conversation drifted naturally into work schedules and Ohio weather. Monica was becoming someone I knew rather than someone I thought about only in terms of help. I saw Lila before I left. She carried a school folder under one arm and complained that a math worksheet had too many problems. Monica reminded her it had exactly the same number as the previous one. Lila rolled her eyes with the confidence of a 9-year-old who believed mathematics had personally betrayed her. I laughed on the way to my car. The ordinary complaint mattered because it was ordinary. She was not the homeless girl in my mind anymore. She was just Lila. A few weeks later, my phone rang while I was leaving work. Monica's name appeared on the screen. She sounded breathless at first, as if she had been holding the news too tightly. The housing program had completed its screening, and she and Lila had been selected as the first family for the bungalow. I stopped beside my car while wind moved through the leaves along the edge of the parking lot. Monica explained that she had given her caseworker permission to share the result with me. I had never seen her application, did not know who else had applied, and had not influenced the choice. That was exactly how I wanted it. The thought of Monica opening the same front door Mom had once planned to decorate for Christmas still hurt. It also felt right. Monica must have heard something in my silence, because her voice softened. I want you to know I'm not asking you to carry us. I chose the simplest answer I know. The bungalow was a bridge in her plan, not a claim on my life. For once, that understanding did not need another explanation. That evening another call came. Her voice was quieter than it had been in months. She said she wanted to see me alone. Not Dad, not Leah, just the two of us. She said she wanted to fix this. For the first time since Christmas, I heard no anger in her voice. But I had learned enough by then to know that wanting something fixed and understanding what had been broken were not necessarily the same thing. Mom chose a coffee shop halfway between our homes. I was relieved she had not asked me to come to the house where I had spent so many years, slipping automatically into old roles at my parents' kitchen table. I knew where the napkins were, which cabinet held the tea, and how quickly I would begin clearing cups just because they were there. A neutral place gave both of us less history to hide inside. She was already seated when I arrived. her coat folded over the chair beside her. There was a cup in front of her, untouched except for a pale ring of foam along the edge. Mom looked smaller than I remembered from Christmas, though nothing about her had physically changed. I had simply stopped seeing her every week. For several seconds after I sat down, neither of us spoke. Months earlier, that silence would have frightened me enough to fill it. This time I waited. Mom finally said she missed me. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were dramatic, because they were exactly what I had wanted to hear in the grocery store on Christmas night. During every strained call that followed, she did not say she missed the house. She did not say the way I organized things, she said she missed her daughter. My throat tightened before I could stop it. I wanted that sentence to be enough. Then she continued. She said what had happened after Christmas had gone too far. The distance, the family tension, the bungalow. She and Dad had built real retirement plans around the house, and she still believed losing it had changed the rest of their lives. I reminded her that they were still safely in their current home and that the transfer had never been completed. She understood the legal dissy. What she struggled with was the promise. That word mattered more than another discussion about title. I had intended the promise as love, but they had moved. Christmas told relatives I had other plans, toasted a future in the bungalow, and still assumed the gift itself would remain untouched. Mom said she and Dad had never imagined I would take something like that back. I watched her turning her wedding ring and understood that this was the part she had not fully examined, their certainty that the gift would survive whatever happened between us. I did not replay every detail of Christmas for her. She already knew them. I only reminded her that the exclusion had been planned, that she had given everyone else a false explanation for my absence, and that Dad had toasted the bungalow while I still thought I was expected the next day. Those were not separate mistakes. They were sequence that brought us here. Then I asked the question I had stopped needing answered, but still wanted her to answer honestly. Whose idea was it? Mom stared through the front window for several seconds. Outside, cars moved through wet spring pavement, their tires sending thin fans of water toward the curb. Dad had suggested celebrating without me, but Mom had agreed. The admission came quietly. He had told her everyone had been walking on eggshells around me. He said the dinner 2 weeks earlier proved I would turn every careless comment into a discussion about respect or boundaries. Mom had wanted Christmas to be easy. She had convinced herself that changing one celebration would not damage anything permanent. Then she admitted the part that mattered most. She had been the one who told the family I had other plans. Not because Dad ordered her to. Because it was easier than saying they had chosen not to invite. The coffee shop seemed louder after that. Mom had not been powerless. She had made a choice. She apologized, but the old instinct to soften consequences followed closely behind. She said she had genuinely believed she was protecting one peaceful evening and had never imagined one Christmas would create months of distance. I looked at the woman who had taught me to make pie crust, sat beside my bed when I had fevers, and remembered to call before important work presentations. Loving her did not make the choice. Harmless peace that requires one person to disappear isn't peace. For once, she did not argue with the wording. I told her I was not erasing her from my life. I was sitting there because I still wanted a relationship with her, but I could not return to a version where every uncomfortable moment ended with me absorbing the cost. I did not want her to miss the things I did. I wanted her to notice me. Mom looked down at the table again after a while. While she asked about the bungalow, her voice had changed. The anger was gone. I told her the house was now operating through the transitional housing program, and that Monica and Lila had been selected through the same screening process as the other applicants. Mom pressed her lips together. For months, some part of her had apparently continued believing I would cool down and reverse the decision. Now she understood the house had another purpose. She did not shout or accuse Monica of taking anything. She simply sat with the information, then reached for her coffee and discovered it had gone cold. I could see the grief in the small motion. For the first time, I felt sympathy without immediately translating it into obligation. I could be sorry that she was hurting without undoing the decision that hurt her. When we stood to leave, Mom hugged me. It was hesitant at first, as though she no longer knew whether she was allowed to assume I would hug her back. I did. Her coat smelled faintly of the same floral perfume she had worn for years. For 1 second I was 10 years old again. Then the moment passed and we stepped apart. Nothing was fixed, but something had been named. Mom had finally admitted that she had not merely failed to stop Dad. She had helped create the Christmas from which I was excluded, then lied to make my absence easier for everyone else to accept. Whether she could live differently after admitting that was a question neither of us could answer yet. Dad was another question entirely. He still believed the problem began with the house. He still believed my boundaries were punishment, and unlike Mom, he had never once asked what he had actually lost when I stopped coming back the way I always had. By the time I saw Dad again in a room full of family, enough months had passed that Christmas no longer felt like an open wound. Every morning, the occasion was an ordinary anniversary dinner for relatives, the kind of event I once would have helped organize without thinking. This time someone else handled the reservation in details. I arrived when I was supposed to arrive and brought only a card. Mom greeted me warmly but carefully. Since our coffee shop conversation, our calls had become shorter but more honest. She had started asking instead of assuming. Dad had made almost no progress. He was polite through dinner, talking about work and weather, as though unresolved things could disappear if he ignored them long enough. When people began gathering coats, he asked me to stay behind. Leah met my eyes but did not tell me to hear him out or remind me he was our father. She simply gave me a small nod. The choice stayed mine. Dad and I moved toward the quieter end of the restaurant, near the windows. He began the conversation the way I expected. He said the family needed to move on. In his version of the previous months, Christmas had become an argument that lasted far beyond the original offense. Mom had apologized. Leah had apologized. Everyone had adjusted. At some point, he believed I needed to stop punishing the family. Then he returned to the bungalow and said he was willing to let the house issue go. For a second I thought I had misunderstood him, but he meant it exactly that way. He was willing to forgive me for changing the future he had. And around a property that had never belonged to him months earlier, that would have sent me racing through every fact I could assemble. This time I did none of that. I looked at my father and asked the only thing that mattered. What exactly are you apologizing for? His expression tightened, not with confusion, with irritation. He said he had already admitted the Christmas decision had been imperfect. He said he should probably have spoken to me directly instead of assuming Mom would handle things. He regretted how I found out. I waited. He kept talking. The longer he spoke, the clearer the absence became. Dad regretted the consequences. He regretted the distance. He regretted losing the bungalow. He regretted that Mom had become unhappy and Leah had stopped automatically supporting him whenever tension appeared. What he had still not named was the choice itself. So I asked again, more quietly this time, what he believed he had done to me. Dad looked out the window. His shoulders dropped slightly. Not in surrender but exhaustion. For the first time, he stopped trying to turn the conversation toward what I had done. Afterward he told me the truth. He had not wanted me at Christmas because he had been tired of feeling challenged. The dinner 2 weeks earlier had stayed with him. So had several other moments when I had refused to let a cutting remark disappear under laughter. He said I had changed. Family gatherings used to feel easy. Lately, he felt as if every sentence might become an issue, every joke might be examined, every decision might turn into a discussion about boundaries. He had wanted one evening where nobody had to think so hard about what they said. I listened. There was no secret beneath it, no hidden scheme, no larger betrayal waiting to be uncovered. The reason was exactly as ordinary and selfish. As it had always appeared, my presence had become inconvenient because I no longer made everyone else's behavior consequence-free. Dad admitted he knew I would be hurt if I found out. He had simply believed the hurt would pass. That part mattered more than anything else he had said. I asked why he had been so certain. He looked at me then. For once, there was no anger in his face, only certainty shaped by years of evidence. "'Cause you always come back." The sentence landed softly. That was what made it devastating. He had not believed I would be fine. He had believed the hurt would never carry a lasting cost because I would return anyway. I thought about birthdays I had organized while still angry. Holidays I had saved after arguments. I did not start calls. I answered because someone needed help. Apologies I accepted. Before anyone understood what they were apologizing for. I had called that forgiveness. Dad had learned to read it as permission. The months behind us had interrupted that lesson. The warranty problem, Mom's birthday, the family lunch, the bungalow. None of them had destroyed the family. They had simply forced everyone to live without assuming I would restore the old arrangement the moment they became uncomfortable. Dad watched my face as though waiting for the old ending to arrive. I told him I was not asking him to agree with every boundary I had set. I was not asking him to become someone entirely different. But I would not return to a family role where my presence was optional whenever it became inconvenient, and my labor became mandatory whenever it was useful, he said. Family was supposed to forgive. I told him I believed that. I also told him forgiveness did not restore automatic access. That was as close as I came to explaining the lesson. The rest was already visible. Dad asked whether I still considered myself part of the family. The question would once have frightened me. It carried the old implication that belonging could be granted or withdrawn by whoever controlled the room. Now it sounded different. I said I was his daughter. That had never changed. What could change was the kind of relationship we chose to build from that fact. If family meant love moving in both directions, I was still there. If it meant everyone retaining permanent access to my time, work, money, and forgiveness no matter how they treated me, then I was finished with that version. Dad did not answer for several seconds. Neither of us moved. The restaurant staff had begun clearing nearby tables. Someone stacked glasses behind the bar. The room was slowly becoming ordinary again. Around us, I picked up my coat. Dad looked older than he had at Christmas. Not defeated, not destroyed. Simply like a man facing a consequence he had assumed would eventually disappear. I did not hug him. I did not refuse to either. The moment simply ended before either of us forced it into something more comfortable. Leah was waiting near the entrance. She did not ask what Dad had said. She did not tell me to go back. She did not remind me that he loved me. She only held the door open. Cold air touched my face as I stepped outside. For most of my life, I had believed returning was proof that I loved my family. Maybe sometimes it had been, but love had not required me to return to the same place in the same way every time that night I drove home without turning around. For the first time I did not feel like I was leaving my family behind. I felt like I had finally stopped leaving myself behind to stay with them. By the time Christmas came around again, the bungalow no longer felt like a place caught between two versions of my life. Monica had kept the job she found in the spring, built savings, and was already talking with her caseworker about the move from transitional housing to something permanent. Lila remained at the same school, had friends, and still complained about homework with the same dramatic outrage she reserved for vegetables. I knew those things because Monica told me. Over the year, our conversations had stopped revolving around programs and housing and drifted into work frustrations, grocery prices, and ordinary life. My own world had widened, too. I saw friends more often instead of postponing them for family logistics. Leah and I had rebuilt something quieter and more honest. Mom and I spoke regularly, though the calls were not always easy. Dad and I remained more distant. He had not become crueler. He had simply lost the certainty that I would return on command. That turned out to be a larger consequence than losing the bungalow ever was. The house itself had become one of several homes the nonprofit used, and by December the staff organized a small year-end volunteer afternoon there. Monica had already agreed to the photo release for herself and Lila, and the nonprofit was careful about what it posted. There were no captions explaining where anyone had lived before, no story about a homeless mother rescued by a donor, no details that belonged to Monica rather than the organization. The photo they eventually shared was ordinary: a wreath on the front door, a few volunteers in the yard, Monica near the porch, Lila holding one end of a string of outdoor lights. She had clearly been instructed not to tangle me laughing at something outside the frame. I barely thought about the picture after it went online until Mom called on Christmas Eve. She wished me Merry Christmas, asked about my plans, and mentioned that she had seen the nonprofit's year-end post. There was a pause before she said the bungalow looked full of life. She did not ask whether I regretted the decision. She did not ask whether the agreement could be changed or call it their house. I could not know exactly what she understood from the photograph, and I did not try to fill in her thoughts for her. I only knew that for the first time, she spoke about the place as something that existed without belonging to her. Before we hung up, Mom said something else. I hope you're somewhere you feel wanted. A year earlier, she would have asked whether I was coming home. The difference was only a few words. Felt enormous. I told her I was. Meant it. That Christmas, I was not going to my parents' house. I was not avoiding it either. Leah had plans that crossed between both sides of her life, and Mom knew I would see her another day. Nothing had been staged as a boycott. There was no dramatic decision to prove who mattered more. I was simply going where I had chosen to be. The gathering was small. Monica and Lila were, along with friends who had become part of my year in ways I had never expected. Leah joined us later after spending time with Mom and Dad. Nobody asked me to coordinate every detail. Someone else had handled dinner. Someone else had remembered ice. I had been assigned dessert because everyone knew I liked the bakery near my apartment. That still made me smile. When I arrived, I carried the chocolate cake with both hands for 1 second, walking toward the door. The memory of the previous Christmas came back so clearly that I could almost feel the grocery store box cutting into my thumb again. The fluorescent lights, Mom's silence, Dad's voice. Everything was easier without you there. A year ago, I had been standing between chocolate cake and apple pie, trying to decide what would please people who had already decided I was not coming. Now I did not have to call anyone and ask whether I should bring something. I had been expected. When the door opened, warm air rolled toward me, carrying the smell of dinner, and cinnamon coats were already piled near the entry. Someone had left music playing too low in the background. Lila appeared almost immediately and stared at the bakery box. Her eyes widened. She remembered. She did not ask whether the whole cake was really for them this time. Grinned and announced that she wanted the corner piece if there was one. Monica told her she was getting whatever piece landed on her plate. That argument lasted exactly long enough to make me laugh. I carried the cake into the dining area. Then I saw my chair. It was not symbolic. Nobody had decorated it or turned it into some lesson about belonging. It was simply there between two other places, with a napkin folded beside the plate and a glass already set in front of it. Someone had counted me before I arrived. That was all. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary. A year earlier, I had been trying to carry enough toward a table that had already decided it was easier without me. Now the simplest thing in the room said more than another explanation could. Someone had expected me before I arrived. A place had been made for me without a reservation. I booked a problem I solved or a gift large enough to justify the chair. I had not earned the seat. I was simply part of the people gathered around it. Leah arrived later carrying a bottle of sparkling cider, and hugged me without asking what I had cooked or whether anything still needed organizing. Monica eventually cut the cake. Lila got her corner piece anyway because someone had apparently decided Christmas was not the day to fight a 9-year-old over frosting. I sat down. No one thanked me for saving the evening because nothing needed saving. And no one asked what problem I could solve next. The room was imperfect, noisy and ordinary. I belonged there without managing it. Last Christmas I had carried a cake toward a table that had already decided it was easier without me. This year my place was set before I ever walked through the door. I wasn't needed there. I was wanted, and I finally knew the difference.